The preacher's voice droned on about sacred vows and holy matrimony. But Teresa Emerson could barely hear him over the pounding of her own heart as she stood at the altar in the Fort Stockton, Texas church on that sweltering June morning in 1878, watching her groom's face twist into an expression of pure revulsion when he finally noticed what she had been trying to hide beneath her long sleeves. "What in God's name is that?" Marcus Thornhill hissed, grabbing her wrist so hard she winced, yanking her arm up to expose the reddish patches of skin that covered her forearm, the telltale signs of the vitiligo that had been spreading across her body for the past 2 years. The condition had stolen the color from her skin in irregular patterns, leaving behind pale white patches on her naturally olive complexion that her mother had desperately tried to conceal with powder and long-sleeved dresses, terrified that the wealthy rancher's son would call off the engagement if he discovered what she called Teresa's affliction. "It is nothing," Teresa whispered, her brown eyes filling with tears as she tried to pull her arm away. "It does not hurt, it is just my skin. It changes color in places, but it is harmless." Harmless. Marcus's voice rose loud enough that the gathered congregation, mostly his family and their business associates, began to murmur and crane their necks to see what was happening. "You are diseased. Did you think you could trick me into marrying damaged goods? This is a disgrace." The preacher cleared his throat uncomfortably, looking between the bride and groom with wide eyes. Teresa's mother let out a strangled sob from the front pew, and her father looked like he wanted to sink through the floorboards. The shame burned through Teresa's chest like a branding iron, and she wanted nothing more than to run from this church, from this town, from the judging eyes that were now fixed on her like she was some kind of curiosity in a traveling show. "I am sorry," she managed to say, though she did not know what she was apologizing for, being born with skin that decided to betray her, or for not having the courage to tell Marcus before now. Her mother had insisted that he would never notice, that they could keep it hidden, but Teresa had known deep down that this moment would come eventually. "Sorry is not good enough," Marcus spat, dropping her wrist like it had burned him. "I will not tie myself to a woman who looks like she is rotting from the outside in. The engagement is over. This wedding is over." He turned on his heel and strode down the aisle, leaving Teresa standing alone at the altar in her white dress that her mother had spent months sewing, the lace collar suddenly feeling like a noose around her throat. The congregation erupted into shocked whispers and gasps, and Teresa felt the walls closing in on her, the air in the church becoming thick and suffocating. Then a voice from the back of the church cut through the chaos, deep and steady and unexpected. "I call it a blessing." Every head in the church swiveled to see who had spoken. Teresa blinked through her tears and saw a tall man standing near the last pew, a cowboy by the look of him, with sun-bronzed skin, dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. He wore dusty trail clothes and held his hat in his hands, and Teresa had no idea who he was or why he had been in the church, but something in his gaze made her breath catch. "Excuse me." Marcus had stopped halfway down the aisle, turning back with an incredulous expression. "What did you just say?" The cowboy stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He was probably around 26 or 27, with the lean, muscular build of a man who spent his life working hard under the Texas sun. "I said I call it a blessing," he repeated, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "That condition she has, it is just her skin showing different colors. There is nothing shameful about it, and if you cannot see past something so superficial to the woman standing in front of you, then you are the one with the real affliction." Marcus's face turned an ugly shade of purple. "Who the hell are you to interrupt my wedding? It does not look much like a wedding anymore," the cowboy observed, glancing pointedly at Marcus's position halfway down the aisle, nowhere near his bride. Looks more like a man running away because he is too small-minded to see what is right in front of him. I ought to call you out for that insult, Marcus blustered, but there was no real conviction in his voice, and Teresa could see the cowardice in his eyes. Marcus was the type of man who was brave only when he had his father's money and name behind him. The cowboy's expression did not change. You know where to find me if you grow a spine. But I suspect you will be too busy explaining to your father why you just humiliated a decent woman in front of half the town. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and stormed out of the church, slamming the door behind him so hard the building shook. The congregation dissolved into complete chaos, people talking over each other, and Teresa's mother rushed forward, wrapping a shawl around Teresa's shoulders as if that could somehow shield her from what had just happened. "Come, we need to get you home," her mother said, her voice thick with tears and mortification. But Teresa found she could not move, could not look away from the cowboy who was now walking slowly toward her. He stopped a respectful distance away and met her eyes, and she saw nothing but kindness there. No pity, no disgust, just a gentle understanding that made something crack open in her chest. "I am sorry for interfering," he said quietly, though the church was still too loud with gossip for anyone else to hear him. "I was just passing through, stopped in to get out of the heat for a moment, and I could not stand there and let him speak to you that way. No woman deserves that." "Who are you?" Teresa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gideon Dawson," he said, and the smallest smile touched his lips. "And I truly meant what I said. That pattern on your skin, it is like the patches on a paint horse, just making you unique. There is no shame in being different." Before Teresa could respond, her mother was pulling her toward the side door of the church, and her father was apologizing profusely to the remaining guests, and Teresa was swept away in the tide of her parents' embarrassment and distress. But as she was ushered out into the blinding sunlight, she looked back once and saw Gideon Dawson still standing in the church, watching her go with an expression she could not quite read. The ride home in her father's wagon was silent, except for her mother's occasional sniffles. They lived on a small homestead about 3 miles outside of Fort Stockton, a modest house with a vegetable garden and a few chickens, nothing like the sprawling ranch that Marcus's family owned. Her father, Robert Emerson, was a clerk at the general store, and her mother, Ellen, took in sewing and mending to help make ends meet. The marriage to Marcus was supposed to have been Teresa's way out, a chance at a better life, but more than that, it was supposed to have been her parents' security. Marcus had promised her father a position managing one of his family's properties, and now all of that was gone. "I am so sorry, Papa," Teresa said as they pulled up to the house, her voice breaking. "I am so sorry, Mama. I ruined everything." "Hush now," her father said, though his voice was heavy. "It is not your fault, Teresa. If that boy could not see your worth, then he was not the right man." But Teresa could see the disappointment in her parents' eyes, the worry about their future, and she knew that no matter what kind words they spoke, the truth was that she had cost them dearly. She went to her small bedroom and carefully removed the wedding dress, hanging it in the wardrobe where it would likely stay forever, a monument to her humiliation. Then she sat on her bed and let herself cry, not just for the loss of Marcus, who she had never truly loved anyway, but for the loss of normalcy, for the reality that her condition would always mark her as different, as damaged. Over the next few days, Teresa barely left the house. Fort Stockton was not a large town, and she knew that everyone would be talking about what had happened at the church, the spectacle of the abandoned bride. Her mother tried to keep her spirits up, bringing her tea and reassuring her that people would forget eventually. But Teresa could not shake the feeling that she was now permanently marked, not just by her skin, but by her shame. On the fourth day after the failed wedding, Teresa was in the garden pulling weeds in the early morning when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up, shading her eyes against the rising sun, and her heart stuttered when she recognized the rider. Gideon Dawson sat tall in his saddle, leading a beautiful paint mare that matched his description from the church, with patches of white and brown across her coat. He dismounted when he reached the edge of the garden, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "Good morning, Miss Emerson. I hope I am not intruding." Teresa scrambled to her feet, suddenly very aware that she was wearing an old work dress with dirt on the knees and her hair in a simple braid down her back. "Mr. Dawson, I did not expect to see you again. I have been in town the past few days, doing some work for the cattle ranch just north of here," he explained. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were all right after what happened. I know it is forward of me, and we have not been properly introduced, but I could not stop thinking about you standing there in that church, and I needed to know that you were well." Something warm unfurled in Teresa's chest at his words, and she found herself taking a step closer. "That is very kind of you. I am as well as can be expected, I suppose. I have been hiding from the gossip mostly." "People always find something to talk about," Gideon said with a slight shake of his head. "Give them a week, and they will move on to something else." "But that does not make it easier right now, I know." "Why did you speak up?" Teresa asked suddenly, the question that had been burning in her mind since that day. "You did not know me. You could have just walked away." Gideon was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "My younger sister, she had a birthmark that covered half her face. Deep red, impossible to hide. People used to stare at her, cross the street to avoid her. Mothers would pull their children away like she was contagious. She was the sweetest, kindest soul you would ever meet, but all anyone ever saw was that mark. She died 3 years ago from fever, and I will regret for the rest of my life that I did not do more to defend her, to make sure she knew she was perfect just as she was. When I saw that man belittling you for something you cannot control, I could not stay silent. I owed it to my sister's memory, and I owed it to you." Tears pricked Teresa's eyes, but these were different from the tears of shame she had cried over the past days. These tears were for the sister Gideon had lost, for the pain he carried, and for the unexpected gift of his compassion. "I am sorry about your sister. She was lucky to have a brother who loved her so much." "I was lucky to have her," Gideon said softly. Then he seemed to shake himself, and his expression shifted to something lighter. "I also came here to ask if you might want to go riding with me sometime. I know it is presumptuous, and I will understand if you say no, but I would like to get to know you better, Teresa Emerson. Not the woman in the wedding dress, just you." Teresa's first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from the possibility of more judgment, more rejection. But as she looked at Gideon, at the genuine hope in his eyes, she found herself nodding. "I would like that. But I should warn you, I have not been on a horse in quite some time." "That is all right," Gideon said with a smile that transformed his whole face. "We will take it slow. How about tomorrow morning? I could meet you here and we could ride out to the creek. It is beautiful this time of year." "Tomorrow morning," Teresa agreed, and when Gideon mounted his horse and tipped his hat to her before riding away, she found herself smiling for the first time since the wedding disaster. That evening, Teresa told her parents about Gideon's visit and his invitation. Her mother looked worried, cautioning her against rushing into anything with a man they barely knew, but her father surprised her by saying, "That was a decent thing he did at the church, standing up for you like that. I think a ride would be harmless enough. Just be careful, Teresa. Your heart has been through enough lately. Teresa promised she would be careful, but as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she could not help but feel a flutter of anticipation. There was something about Gideon that felt different, safe, like he saw past her skin to something deeper. The next morning dawned clear and warm, promising another hot Texas day. Teresa dressed in her riding skirt and a long-sleeved blouse, still self-conscious about her arms despite Gideon's words. She braided her dark hair and pinned it up, and when she caught her reflection in the small mirror, she tried to see herself the way Gideon seemed to see her, not as damaged or shameful, but as unique. Gideon arrived right on time, leading a gentle chestnut mare that he said was borrowed from the ranch. He helped Teresa mount, his hands steady and respectful, and then they set off toward the creek that ran a few miles east of town. The morning air was still relatively cool, and Teresa found herself relaxing as they rode, the rhythmic motion of the horse soothing something inside her. "Tell me about yourself," Gideon said as they followed the well-worn path. "Where did you grow up? What do you like to do?" "I have lived in Fort Stockton my whole life," Teresa said, feeling suddenly boring. "My father works at the general store, and I help my mother with her sewing work. I like to read when I can get books from the lending library, and I used to love riding when I was younger, before my condition started and I became too self-conscious to go out much." "What do you like to read?" Gideon asked with genuine interest. "Poetry, mostly. Whitman, Dickinson. And adventure stories when I can find them. I like imagining places beyond Fort Stockton, even if I will probably never see them." "Why do you say that?" Gideon glanced over at her. "You are young. There is a whole world out there." "Young women do not just go gallivanting around the world," Teresa said with a small laugh. "Especially not ones with conditions that make people stare." "Maybe not alone," Gideon said thoughtfully, "but with the right companion, anything is possible." They reached the creek, which was really more of a stream this time of year, but it was surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade. Gideon helped Teresa dismount, and they sat on the bank, watching the water trickle over smooth stones. Teresa pulled off her boots and stockings, hitching up her skirt enough to dip her feet in the cool water, and she saw Gideon deliberately not looking at the white patches that had appeared on her ankles and feet. "Can I ask you about it?" he said after a while. "Your condition, I mean." "I do not want to pry, but I would like to understand." Teresa appreciated that he asked rather than just demanding or assuming. "It is called vitiligo. A doctor in San Antonio diagnosed it when it first started appearing 2 years ago. He said it is not contagious, not dangerous, just something to do with the pigment in my skin being destroyed. It can spread or it can stop, there is no way to know. Some people get it all over their body, others just in patches. There is no cure, no treatment. I just have to live with it." "Does it hurt?" "No. Physically, I cannot feel any difference, but emotionally," Teresa paused, swallowing hard. "It makes me feel like I am disappearing piece by piece, like my body is betraying me." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My sister used to say that she was marked by God, that her birthmark meant she was meant for something special. I did not understand what she meant until after she was gone, but I think she was saying that being different is not a curse, it is just a different path. You have not done anything wrong, Teresa. Your body is not betraying you, it is just telling its own unique story." Teresa felt tears threaten again, but she blinked them back. "Thank you for saying that. Most people just look away or whisper about me when they think I cannot hear." "Then they are fools," Gideon said simply. He reached over and gently took her hand, and Teresa's breath caught at the contact. His hand was rough with calluses but warm and steady. "I see you, Teresa. Not your condition, not your skin. I see a woman who stood at that altar with dignity even when she was being treated abhorrently. I see someone strong and beautiful. You barely know me, Teresa whispered, but she did not pull her hand away. Then let me get to know you, Gideon said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I am not going anywhere. I have been working at the Rocking D Ranch and they have offered me a permanent position. I will be staying in Fort Stockton for the foreseeable future, so we have time. They spent the rest of the morning by the creek, talking about everything and nothing. Gideon told her about growing up in Oklahoma, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 19, about taking care of his sister until she died, and then wandering from town to town, working ranches and trying to outrun his grief. Teresa told him about her dreams of seeing the ocean someday, about the poems she sometimes tried to write but never showed anyone, about how trapped she felt in this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. When they finally rode back to her house, the sun was high and hot, and Teresa felt lighter than she had in months. Gideon helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. And when he asked if he could call on her again, Teresa said yes without hesitation. Over the next weeks, Gideon became a constant presence in Teresa's life. He would ride out to the homestead in the evenings after his work at the ranch was done, and they would walk together through the fields or sit on the porch and talk until the stars came out. Her parents gradually warmed to him, especially when they saw how respectful and genuine he was, how he never looked at Teresa with anything but admiration. Teresa found herself falling for him in a way she had never fallen for Marcus. With Marcus, the engagement had been practical, arranged by their parents, and she had felt like a prize to be won rather than a person to be known. With Gideon, every conversation felt like a gift, every smile felt earned. He made her laugh with stories of ornery cattle and the characters at the ranch. He listened when she talked about her fears and her hopes, and he never, not once, made her feel like her vitiligo was something to be ashamed of. One evening in late July, they were sitting by the creek again, watching the fireflies dance over the water when Gideon turned to her and said, "I am falling in love with you, Teresa. I need you to know that." Teresa's heart felt like it might burst out of her chest. "I am falling in love with you too," she admitted, and saying the words out loud made them real in a way that terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. Gideon reached up and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek where a patch of vitiligo had recently appeared. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known," he said, and then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Teresa had been kissed before by Marcus, dry pecks that felt obligatory, but this was different. This kiss made her feel alive, made her feel seen and wanted and cherished. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I want to marry you, Teresa. I know it is fast and I know people will talk, but I do not care. I want to spend my life with you." "Yes," Teresa said, not needing to think about it. "Yes, I will marry you." They told her parents that night, and while her mother worried about the speed of it all, her father shook Gideon's hand and said, "You are a good man, Gideon Dawson. You treat my daughter well." "I will spend every day of my life making her happy," Gideon promised, and Teresa believed him. They were married 3 weeks later in a quiet ceremony at the same church where Teresa had been abandoned at the altar, but this time it was completely different. Only close friends and family were invited, and when Teresa walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Gideon was waiting for her with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face that told her everything she needed to know. This time, she wore a simple dress with short sleeves, no longer hiding the patches on her arms. This time, when she reached the altar, her groom took her hands and held them like they were precious. And this time, when the preacher asked if Gideon would take Teresa to be his lawfully wedded wife, he said, "I do," with such conviction that Teresa felt it in her bones. Their wedding night was spent in a small room at the Fort Stockton Hotel, and Gideon was patient and gentle as he helped her out of her dress, kissing each patch of vitiligo he uncovered, whispering that she was perfect, that she was his. Teresa cried, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming love for this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. They moved into a small cabin on the Rocking D Ranch, and Teresa threw herself into making it a home. She planted a garden, made curtains for the windows, and learned to cook the meals that Gideon loved. Gideon worked hard on the ranch, often coming home dusty and exhausted, but he always had energy for Teresa, always made time to hold her and talk to her and make her feel like the center of his world. Life was not perfect. There were still people in town who stared at Teresa, who whispered about her condition and speculated about why Gideon had married her. But Gideon never let it bother him, and gradually, Teresa learned to let it roll off her back too. She had Gideon, and that was all that mattered. In the fall, Teresa discovered she was pregnant, and Gideon was over the moon with joy. He became even more protective and attentive, making sure she did not overwork herself, bringing her little gifts from town, talking to her belly at night and telling their unborn child how loved they were going to be. What if the baby has it too? Teresa asked one night as they lay in bed, Gideon's hand resting on her growing stomach. What if they have vitiligo? Then they will be beautiful, just like their mother, Gideon said without hesitation. And we will teach them that different is not bad, it is just different. They will grow up knowing they are loved exactly as they are. Teresa kissed him, grateful beyond words for his acceptance, his love, his unwavering belief in her. Their son was born in early May of 1879, a healthy baby boy with a lusty cry and Gideon's dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Gideon's father, and as Teresa held her newborn son in her arms, she saw that his skin was clear, no patches of vitiligo. She felt a complicated mix of relief and guilt, relieved that her son would not have to face the judgment she had faced, but guilty for feeling relieved as if she was betraying herself. Gideon seemed to sense her thoughts. "He is perfect," he said, kissing her forehead, "and so are you. If he had had vitiligo, he would still be perfect. You know that, right?" "I know," Teresa said, and she meant it. She had learned slowly to see herself through Gideon's eyes, to understand that her worth was not determined by her appearance. Samuel was a happy baby, and Gideon was a devoted father, often coming home from the ranch and immediately scooping his son into his arms, talking to him in nonsense syllables that made Teresa laugh. They were a family, and Teresa had never been happier. When Samuel was 6 months old, tragedy struck the Rocking D Ranch. There was a stampede during a cattle drive, and 3 men were killed, including the ranch foreman. Gideon had been nearby when it happened, and though he had not been injured, he came home that night shaken and pale, holding Teresa and Samuel close and whispering prayers of gratitude that he was still alive. The ranch owner, a gruff but fair man named Henry Donnelly, promoted Gideon to foreman in the aftermath, recognizing his skill and dedication. It meant more responsibility and longer hours, but it also meant better pay and more security for their family. Gideon threw himself into the work, determined to honor the men who had died by doing his job well. Teresa supported him however she could, packing him hearty lunches, keeping the cabin running smoothly, raising their son. She also started taking in sewing work again, not because they needed the money as desperately as before, but because she enjoyed it and it gave her something to do during the long days when Gideon was at work. One afternoon in late summer, Teresa was in town at the general store, Samuel on her hip, when she ran into Marcus Thornhill. He was standing by the counter, and when he saw her, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been regret. "Teresa," he said, taking off his hat, "I heard you married that cowboy, and you have a child now." "I did and I do," Teresa said, keeping her voice neutral. Samuel grabbed at her necklace, and she gently disentangled his chubby fingers. "How have you been, Marcus?" "Well enough," he said, though he did not look well. He looked pale and unhappy, and Teresa felt a flicker of pity for him. "I want to apologize for what I said at the church. It was cruel and uncalled for. I have regretted it every day since." Teresa was quiet for a moment, processing his words. A year ago, she would have given anything to hear this apology. Now it felt almost irrelevant. "I appreciate you saying that, Marcus. I forgive you. Are you happy?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. Teresa thought about Gideon, about the way he kissed her goodbye every morning and hello every evening, about the way he looked at Samuel like he was the sun and stars, about the way he had transformed her life from one of shame to one of love. "Yes," she said simply. "I am very happy." Marcus nodded, looking away. "I am glad. I married Elizabeth Harmon last month. Our parents arranged it. She is a good woman, but I do not think either of us are particularly happy. I think I made a mistake, Teresa. A terrible mistake." "You made the choice you thought was right at the time," Teresa said, not unkindly. "We all have to live with our choices. I hope you and Elizabeth find happiness together, Marcus. I truly do." She left the store feeling lighter, as if a weight she had not known she was carrying had been lifted. Marcus's rejection, which had once felt like the end of the world, now seemed like the beginning of her real life, the life she was meant to live. That evening, when Gideon came home and she told him about the encounter, he pulled her into his arms and said, "He was a fool to let you go, but I am grateful every day that he did. Otherwise, I might never have found you." "Do you believe in fate?" Teresa asked, looking up at him. "Do you think we were meant to find each other?" "I do not know about fate," Gideon said thoughtfully. "But I know that I walked into that church at exactly the right moment, and I know that speaking up was the best decision I ever made. Whether that was fate or luck or divine intervention, I am just grateful it happened." As the years passed, their love only deepened. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Grace, born in 1881, and another son named Lucas, born in 1883. Grace inherited Teresa's vitiligo, small patches appearing on her hands and neck when she was about 2 years old. Teresa's first instinct was fear that her daughter would face the same judgment she had. But Gideon sat her down and reminded her that the world was changing, that their children would grow up surrounded by love and acceptance, that they would teach Grace to be proud of who she was. And they did. From the time Grace was old enough to understand, they told her that her patches were special, that they made her unique and beautiful. When other children stared or asked questions, Grace learned to answer with confidence. "It is just how my skin is. My mama has it too. It does not hurt and it is not contagious. It is just part of who I am." Teresa watched her daughter navigate the world with a courage she had never had at that age, and she was grateful beyond measure. Gideon had been right. With the right foundation of love and support, Grace was unstoppable. Samuel grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved working with his father on the ranch. Lucas was more mischievous, always getting into trouble and making everyone laugh. They were a loud, chaotic, loving family, and their cabin rang with laughter and arguments, and the general noise of children growing up. Gideon proved to be not just a skilled rancher, but also a natural leader. Under his management, the Rocking D Ranch prospered, and in 1885, Henry Donnelly offered to make Gideon a partner in the operation. It was an incredible opportunity, and Gideon accepted on the condition that he could build a proper house for his growing family. They broke ground on the new house that spring, a sturdy 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a wraparound porch. Teresa cried when she saw it completed, overwhelmed by how far they had come from that day in the church when she had felt like her life was over. "From abandoned bride to ranch partner's wife," she said to Gideon one evening as they stood on the porch of their new home, watching their children play in the yard. "I never could have imagined this." "You were never abandoned," Gideon said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "You were being set free so you could find where you really belonged. With me." Life was not without its challenges. There were droughts that threatened the ranch, illnesses that swept through the family, conflicts with neighboring ranchers over water rights and boundaries. But through it all, Teresa and Gideon faced everything together, their love a constant foundation. In 1888, when Teresa was 30 and Gideon was 36, her vitiligo suddenly stopped spreading. The doctors had no explanation for it, just said that sometimes it happened that way. The patches that had appeared over the years remained, scattered across her body like maps of unknown territories, but no new ones formed. Teresa found she did not care either way. She had long since stopped seeing them as shameful. They were just part of her story, part of the journey that had led her to Gideon. Samuel left for college in San Antonio in 1892, wanting to study agriculture and animal husbandry, so he could bring new techniques back to the ranch. It was hard for Teresa to watch her firstborn leave, but she was proud of his ambition. Grace, now 11, was already showing an interest in teaching, spending hours helping the younger children in town learn to read. Lucas, at 9, was still trying to figure out where he fit, but he had his father's steady hands and his mother's creative spirit. In the spring of 1893, Fort Stockton held a celebration for its 25th anniversary, and the whole town came together for a festival with music and food and dancing. Teresa wore a new dress with short sleeves, her patches visible for all to see, and she danced with Gideon under the stars, feeling young and free and completely happy. As they spun around the dance floor, Teresa caught sight of Marcus Thornhill standing on the edge of the crowd with his wife Elizabeth and their 3 children. He looked tired and older than his years, and when his eyes met Teresa's, there was a sadness there that made her heart ache for him. She nodded politely and he nodded back, and then Gideon spun her away and she forgot about Marcus entirely. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked, noticing her distraction. "How lucky I am," Teresa said, resting her head on his shoulder. "How that worst day of my life turned out to be the beginning of the best life I could have imagined." "We make our own luck," Gideon said, but he was smiling. "But I know what you mean. I walked into that church angry at the world, missing my sister, feeling lost. And then I saw you, and something clicked into place. Like I had been wandering and finally found my way home." They danced until the band stopped playing, until their children were tired and complaining, until the night air turned cool and the stars wheeled overhead. And when they finally went home to their house on the ranch, climbing into bed together with the comfortable familiarity of 15 years of marriage, Teresa thought about the girl she had been, standing at that altar in shame, and the woman she had become, loved and confident and whole. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Samuel graduated from college and returned to the ranch, bringing with him a wife named Mary and new ideas about cattle breeding. Grace went off to teachers' college in Dallas, writing long letters home about her studies and her friends. Lucas surprised everyone by discovering a talent for working with horses, becoming one of the best horse trainers in the region. Gideon's hair started to show threads of silver, and Teresa noticed more lines around his eyes, but he was still the same man who had defended her in that church, still steady and kind and completely devoted to her. They had grown older together, had built a life together, had weathered storms together. In 1898, on their 20th wedding anniversary, Gideon took Teresa back to the creek where he had first told her he loved her. It looked much the same as it had all those years ago, the cottonwood trees providing shade, the water trickling over smooth stones. "I have been thinking about that day in the church," Gideon said as they sat on the bank, holding hands like teenagers. "About how angry I was, how much pain I was carrying. And I have been thinking about how you helped heal that pain, Teresa. Loving you, building a life with you, it has been the greatest honor of my existence." "You saved me," Teresa said, squeezing his hand. "In every way a person can be saved. You made me believe I was worthy of love, worthy of happiness. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "We saved each other," Gideon corrected gently. "That is what love does. It rescues us from our own darkness." They renewed their vows that day, just the two of them under the cottonwood trees, promising again to love and honor each other for the rest of their days. And when they went home, their family was waiting with a surprise party, the house full of children and grandchildren and friends, all celebrating the love story that had started with a cruel rejection and a cowboy's brave declaration. Grace married a teacher named William Patterson in 1899, and they moved to El Paso, where he had been offered a position at a progressive school that welcomed Grace despite her vitiligo. Teresa cried at the wedding, proud of her daughter's confidence and courage. Samuel and Mary had their first child in 1900, a baby girl they named Teresa in honor of her grandmother. And holding her tiny granddaughter in her arms, Teresa marveled at the fullness of her life. Lucas fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a fiery young woman named Catherine who loved horses as much as he did. They were married in 1902 in a simple ceremony at the ranch, and Lucas built them a house on the eastern edge of the property, staying close to his parents. In 1905, Henry Donnelly passed away, leaving his share of the ranch to Gideon in his will. Gideon was moved beyond words by the gesture, and he ran the Rocking D Ranch with the same care and dedication Henry had shown. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful operations in West Texas. Teresa was 50 years old now, her dark hair streaked with silver. Her vitiligo patches faded somewhat but still visible. She looked at herself in the mirror one morning and saw a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had overcome. The shame and fear that had once defined her were distant memories, replaced by confidence and joy. That evening, as she and Gideon sat on their porch watching the sunset, their grandchildren playing in the yard, Teresa said, "Do you remember what you said in the church that day? When Marcus called my condition a disgrace?" "I said I called it a blessing," Gideon replied, smiling at the memory. "Did you really mean that? Or were you just trying to defend me?" Gideon turned to look at her, taking her hand in both of his. "I meant every word. Your vitiligo brought you to me, Teresa. If you had been perfect in Marcus's eyes, you would have married him, and I never would have known you. Your condition was the blessing that changed both our lives. It made you doubt yourself, yes, but it also made you stronger, more compassionate, more aware of what really matters. And it gave me the chance to love you." Teresa felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I love you so much, Gideon Dawson." "I love you too, Teresa Dawson. more than words can express. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Their children were grown and thriving, their grandchildren were healthy and happy, and they had built something lasting and good together. In 1908, the town of Fort Stockton held a ceremony honoring longtime residents who had contributed to the community's growth and prosperity. Gideon was recognized for his work at the Rocking D Ranch, and Teresa was recognized for her years of teaching Sunday school and her charity work with families in need. As they stood together accepting the commendations, Teresa looked out at the gathered crowd and saw respect in their eyes, not judgment. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached Teresa. It took her a moment to recognize Elizabeth Harmon, now Elizabeth Thornhill, looking worn and weary. Marcus had died 2 years earlier from a heart condition, leaving Elizabeth a widow with 4 grown children. "Teresa," Elizabeth said hesitantly, "I wanted to tell you something I should have said years ago. I have always envied you." Teresa was genuinely surprised. "Envied me? Why?" "Because you found real love. Because despite everything that happened at your first wedding, you ended up with a man who truly cherishes you. Marcus and I had a civil marriage. We did our duty to each other, but there was never the kind of love you and Gideon have. Everyone can see it when they look at you too. You glow with it." Teresa felt a wave of compassion for this woman who had lived so much of her life without the love that had defined Teresa's own. "I am sorry, Elizabeth. I hope you found happiness in other ways." "I did. My children, my grandchildren, they are my joy. But if I could go back and choose differently, I would have waited for love rather than settling for obligation." Elizabeth smiled sadly. "You were right to wait, even if you did not know you were waiting. You were right to end up with the man who saw your worth." After Elizabeth left, Teresa stood for a moment, processing the conversation. Gideon came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What was that about?" "Just closing old circles," Teresa said, leaning back against him. "Realizing how different my life could have been." "Thank God it was not," Gideon murmured, kissing her temple. "The years moved faster now, the way they do when you are living fully and happily." More grandchildren arrived, bringing noise and chaos and joy to the ranch. Samuel took over most of the day-to-day operations, allowing Gideon to slow down a bit, though he could never fully retire from the work he loved. Grace and William had twins, a boy and a girl, and the girl had vitiligo just like her mother and grandmother. Grace wrote to Teresa about how she was teaching her daughter the same lessons Teresa had taught her, how beauty came in many forms, how differences should be celebrated, not hidden. Lucas and Catherine had 4 children in rapid succession, and their house was always full of laughter and horses and the smell of leather and hay. Teresa loved visiting them, loved sitting on their porch and watching the next generation grow. In 1912, Gideon developed a cough that would not go away. The doctor said it was likely from years of breathing in dust on cattle drives, that his lungs were weakened. He was put on bed rest, which drove him crazy, but he obeyed because Teresa insisted. She nursed him through that winter, reading to him, sitting with him, holding his hand through the long nights when he could not sleep. He recovered somewhat in the spring, but he was never quite as strong as he had been. It aged him, made him more aware of his mortality. On his 60th birthday in 1913, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, he made a speech that brought everyone to tears. "I have lived a good life," he said, his voice still strong despite his weakened lungs. "I have loved deeply, worked hard, and raised fine children. When I was a young man, I thought I knew what mattered. I thought it was about land and cattle and legacy. But standing here now, looking at all of you, I know the truth. What matters is love. What matters is treating people with dignity and respect. What matters is seeing past the surface to the soul underneath. My wife taught me that. Teresa, you have been the greatest blessing of my life." Teresa could not stop crying, could not stop thinking about how close she had come to missing all of this. How one man's cruelty and another man's kindness had changed the entire trajectory of her existence. Gideon lived another 5 years, years of sunsets on the porch, years of watching grandchildren grow, years of quiet mornings in bed with Teresa, just holding each other and being grateful for another day. When he finally passed away in his sleep in the spring of 1918, Teresa was lying next to him, and she knew the moment he was gone because a part of her went with him. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire town, testament to the kind of man Gideon had been, the impact he had made. Teresa stood at his grave, flanked by her children and grandchildren, and she thought about that day in the church 40 years earlier when a stranger had spoken up for her and changed everything. "Thank you," she whispered to the sky, to Gideon's spirit, wherever it was now. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for giving me this beautiful life." The grief was immense, but so was the gratitude. Teresa had been loved thoroughly and completely, had been cherished every day of her marriage, and that was more than many people could say. She would miss Gideon every moment for the rest of her life, but she would not regret a single second of their time together. She continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by her family. Samuel ran the operation now, and he was good at it, had inherited his father's eye for cattle and his mother's head for numbers. Grace visited often with her husband and children, and Lucas and Catherine were just down the road. Teresa's days were full of grandchildren wanting stories, of helping with church functions, of tending her garden and remembering. On the 40th anniversary of her wedding to Gideon, Teresa made the journey to the creek, moving slowly now with her 70-year-old bones. She sat on the bank where they had sat so many times, and she let herself cry for the man she had lost, for the love they had shared, for the life they had built together. But she also smiled, remembering his laugh, his steady hands, his unwavering belief in her. She remembered the way he had looked at her on their wedding day, like she was the most precious thing in the world. She remembered the way he had held their babies, the way he had taught their children to ride, the way he had danced with her at countless celebrations and gatherings. And she remembered that moment in the church when he had spoken up, when he had called her condition a blessing, when he had seen past her shame to her worth. That moment had been the hinge on which her entire life had turned, and she would be grateful for it until her dying day. Teresa lived to be 82 years old, passing away peacefully in her sleep in 1930, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Gideon had created. Her funeral was held in the same church where she had been married twice, once abandoned and once cherished, and the preacher spoke of her kindness, her strength, and the love story that had inspired everyone who knew her. Grace gave the eulogy, speaking through tears about her mother's courage, about how she had taught her daughter to be proud of her differences, about how she had transformed pain into purpose and shame into strength. "My mother could have let that day at the altar define her in bitterness," Grace said. "But instead, she let my father's love redefine her in joy. They showed all of us what real love looks like, what it means to see someone for who they truly are." They buried Teresa next to Gideon under a cottonwood tree on the ranch, and on the shared headstone, Samuel had inscribed, "Gideon and Teresa Dawson." He called it a blessing. She called him her miracle. Together they built a love that death cannot diminish. Years later, their great-grandchildren would ask about the inscription, and the family would tell the story of the abandoned bride and the cowboy who defended her, of the condition that brought them together, of the love that had lasted through 4 decades and continued to ripple outward through generations. They would tell it as a reminder that beauty comes in many forms, that true love sees past surfaces, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to our greatest blessings. The Rocking D Ranch continued to operate for decades after both Teresa and Gideon were gone, passed down through their children and grandchildren, a lasting legacy of the life they had built together. And in Fort Stockton, the story of the cowboy who had spoken up in the church, who had called a woman's condition a blessing when everyone else saw only disgrace, became the kind of legend that towns hold on to, a reminder of what it means to truly see another person, to love them not despite their differences, but because of the whole picture of who they are. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever comes after this life, Gideon and Teresa were together again, dancing under endless stars, whole and happy and forever intertwined, their love story complete and perfect and eternal.